Survivorship bias is the human tendency to focus on survivors instead of whatever you would call a non-survivor, depending on the situation. Now, sometimes that could be the living instead of the dead. Sometimes it could be successes instead of failures. Sometimes it could be winners instead of losers. Because in any process that leaves behind non-survivors, those non-survivors are often destroyed or muted or removed from your view. And that means, naturally, of course, if all that's left behind are successes, then that's all you'll pay attention to. You won't even notice the failures. And even though you could learn a great deal from the information that's inside the things that are missing, you may not even realize that there's missing information at all. Now, there are some really cool examples of this in our modern life, in everyday life, things that are a lot simpler that help you understand this. One of my favorites is just log cabins, all right? Frontier log cabins. There's a photographer I love. His name is Mike Johnston. He has a blog called The Online Photographer, and he says that he takes pictures of frontier log cabins, and he says when he shows them off to people, they often say to him, "Wow, look at these log cabins. You know, they really don't know how to make things like they used to." And he says, "Well, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, look, these log cabins, they're made out of wood and mud, and they're still standing for hundreds of years. I mean, we couldn't make something like that with modern materials that we could expect to last that long." And he says, "No, you're seeing this all wrong. 99% of all log cabins fell right over." They didn't survive their first bout with harsh weather, or they began to rot right away. I mean, they were made with terrible materials. No, all you can see are the rare few that did survive, and they're misrepresenting the idea of a log cabin to you. You're missing what is missing. Another great example would be the restaurant business. Now, if you live in an area that has a lot of really successful restaurants, and they're making money hand over fist, you might be sitting there eating one day and go, "I should get into the restaurant business. It looks like you really can make a lot of money. I mean, look at this. I don't see a single restaurant in this area that's not making a lot of money." And there's the problem. You're being hit by survivorship bias again, because if you see a cluster of super successes, that is evidence for a business you should avoid, because they must be super successful to survive in their hostile environment. Most restaurants fail after about 3 years, statistically speaking. So when they fail, they are removed from your view. They go away. And all that's left behind are the super successes that skew your information in the direction of survivors. These super successful restaurants misrepresent the restaurant business as a whole. So there's another great example of all this. Oh, yes, I remember. Nassim Taleb has a great quote about restaurants. It's, "The cemetery of failed restaurants is very silent." So my favorite example, though, has got to be Brad Pitt. So let's all think about Brad Pitt for a second. Envision Brad Pitt in your mind. Now, Brad Pitt is he's a super successful person. I think all of us have a sort of a Brad Pitt in our profession, someone that we all know about, someone that we're all aware of. They're an example of a super successful person who's achieved a great deal, who's very driven, very skilled, and we all know about them because of this. And this is the sort of person that we seek. So this is a person that we want to get advice from. This is the kind of person we want to sit down and have an interview with. And we want to gain from them. We want to pick out of their lives and see what their decisions were and sort of see if we can gain a measure of success like them, see what their secrets are. But there's a real problem here. As Google engineer Barnaby James says, skill will allow you to place more bets on the table, but it's not a guarantee of success. Because I want you to imagine that the week that Brad Pitt came to Hollywood, thousands of other actors came to Hollywood that same week who were just as attractive, maybe more attractive, just as skilled, maybe more skilled, just as driven, maybe even more driven. But for some variable that they don't even understand themselves, something something they could not have anticipated, really, they had to move back home, and they will never be asked to go inside the actor's studio. They will never be asked for advice on how not to fail, but that is a giant bank of information about how not to fail, because they know. Brad Pitt can't give you advice on how not to fail because all of his decisions worked out for him. So, as Google engineer Barnaby James adds, beware advice from the successful. See, when you look at all of these magazines that we love to read about successful people that are detailing the stories of their lives, or you look at books that detail the biographies of a business that has survived a hostile work environment, and these people look back and they tell you about the decisions that they made that led to where they are, you must be careful because they're looking backwards with the clarity of hindsight. And There's a great psychologist, his name is Daniel Kahneman, and he writes about this, and he advises us to be very careful that when we think about following in the footsteps of these iconic businesses that have these sort of fairy tale existences in our culture, if you're thinking about following the steps of one of these businesses and sort of going one by one through their decisions and mimicking them, he suggests that what you do is at first you go into their history and look at a point when they were just when they were just getting by, and see if anyone in that company could anticipate what was going to happen after they made this big decision that we now herald. Did they know how the company would unfold based off of what they were about to do? And he says that you will never see this. It never happens. Because what happens is when these people tell their stories, when they go back and tell their biographies, they're seeing in the moment certainty when at the time there was really only chaos. So the great lesson from survivorship bias is that the advice business is a monopoly run by survivors. That means that they can't tell you what you ought not to do, what you shouldn't do. They don't really even know themselves most of the time, even though it may feel that way. So if you base all of your knowledge about how to do things off of the super successful, or you pore over books that detail the histories of companies that shook the planet, your knowledge of the world will be extremely biased and enormously incomplete because you're not learning about the failures. And you should really pay attention to failures. Seek them out. See if you can find them. Listen to what they have to say. Because people who have failed are rarely offered money to give advice on how not to fail. They're rarely given the opportunity to speak at a commencement or a high school graduation. And when their knowledge of the world is lost, they become like those bombers that never made it home. Now, one last thing before I leave you, and that is when I first heard about the story of the bombers, I thought that when I would research it and find the true story of the bombers and go through all the information these people left behind, that it would be everywhere, but it's not. In fact, they only started talking about it, these mathematicians and scientists, in the 80s. It surfaced just as anecdotes when they were trying to put together an award ceremony posthumously for Abraham Wall. And I think about how interesting and fascinating that story is and how we can learn from it. It's very juicy. And we almost lost it to history, which means there are probably so many stories that we could have learned from these numerical soldiers that we'll never know about because they didn't make their way out of the war. They didn't survive. They didn't get into a book or a journal or a magazine. And that's probably true of so many things from the past that are important. The past reaches us through a million filters, and a great deal is never recorded or is tossed aside by the person holding those filters because they believe that there is something that's more interesting or more beautiful or more audacious. All we can ever know about the people who built the world in which we now live, all we can ever learn from history reaches us through stories that, for whatever reason, survived. Thanks.